Thanks, everybody, for coming along. And I think this is the most filmed I've ever been while talking. But I'll try to get through it quickly and painlessly. But I will want to talk about pain today. I think probably the reason that Rob sort of invited me to join this jamboree, which has been very stimulating, is that I have written about the history of the design of computer interfaces and did a book on the history of IBM. And its collaborations with a whole host of modernist architects, graphic designers, industrial designers, and so on, amongst many other things, to try to solve a particular problem, which is how do human beings interact with computing machinery, and how to stabilize that relationship in aesthetic terms. But when I actually got a chance to talk to Rob about what he did want me to talk about, he's like, no, don't talk about that. They can read that. So I said, fine. Well, maybe I'll talk about something that I didn't get around to doing in the book, which is another piece of research that's sort of ongoing, which is about the history of chair design, particularly in the 20th century. Here you go, a bunch of iconic 20th century chairs designed by architects for the most part, and the instances I've given you here, they're probably very familiar. But what I want to do is to actually locate within the history of the design of chairs the emergence of a particular attitude towards design that I think has served as a kind of fixed idea for the way that we interact with all sorts of other equipment. And that is the notion of the pure surface. And its intimate application to the surface of the body in particular. I'm not going to bore you with the long history of chairs. Chairs are very old machinery. They've been around, as you can see here, from way, way back. There you get some greatest hits. We'll cruise through some highlights of the history. But what is peculiar about the history of chairs is that for a long time nobody sat in them. They were the province of only cultural elites, and the aristocracy at the most sat in chairs. The rest of us peons didn't do that at all. If we sat on benches or on one-legged stools. They were tools for performing work, or we sat on the ground in many instances. It's only in this period here where we're into the Enlightenment, that the rise of the bourgeoisie, of capital markets in the mercantilist capitalist period, and then in industrial capitalism. Here's one of my favorites, chair made out of pieces of the HMS Victory to celebrate or commemorate the Battle of Trafalgar, that chair sitting becomes endemic in Western cultures. And we get a reconfiguration totally of the way that we apply this sort of seemingly basic and simple tool to various cultural applications, not just practical applications, but symbolic ones. Chairs are all bound up in the way that we communicate to one another about power, and there are many sayings and folklore and so on that to overturn chairs is to overturn a social order, and the history of art is full of images of revolution that make use of the chair as a kind of site of reconfiguring human relationships. And that doesn't change in the 19th and 20th centuries at all. But the riddle that I'm going to try to sort of explore with you guys today is how it is that this idea, this very complex symbolizing and working machine of the chair, which has just an incredible diversity of array of articulations, gets re-theorized as a single surface, compound, curved, very complex, but nonetheless sheer surface that would be applied to the human body to do a particularly weird thing. And I'll get to what that weird thing is in a second. So I want to start in maybe a kind of surprising spot for some people, but with the Bauhaus. The young Marcel Breuer, who was put in charge of the woodworking shop at the Bauhaus, in Weimar and then again in Dessau, and cranked out an extraordinary array of chair designs throughout the 1920s in that capacity. And to sum up his achievements years later, he created this poster, 1926, mapping his progress into the almost the whole human history of chair design done in miniature, beginning with his so-called African chair done with Günther Stützle in 1921, and then progressing, as you can see, I hope quite clearly. I brought some more detailed images that will make this easier to register, a progress towards a simplification of the chair and a rendering of it as a structural armature that holds surfaces in tension. So we get this woven surface here. We get this even more tenuous one influenced by Gerrit Rietveld. There you can see what he's looking to quite clearly. This absolutely beautiful chair here, which you can see in profile there. And then he also leaves a bunch of his chairs out. He made many more designs. So ones that don't really conform to this linear trajectory towards the tension structure are eliminated, despite the fact that they're beautiful design objects in their own right. Culminating in 1925 with his famous design for the Vasa Lee Chair, named after his friend and fellow Bauhäusler Vasa Lee Kandinsky, where he really seems to have achieved the structural principle that he'd been working towards over all those years. And of course, he worked it out in other ways as well. In subsequent designs, he continued working. But in this funny poster that he uses to make this argument about the trajectory of the history of the design of the chair, rather grandiosely projected his own history as well, we get this weird moment in this film at the end, and I want to kind of latch on to this image and use it as a motivation to explore what happens subsequently in chair design. So we get this gotcha moment. The last frame in this film has a figure of a seated woman, excuse me, suspended in thin air, her posture relaxed, arms and legs draped over invisible supports. The chair, it seems, has disappeared. An inversion, then, not unlike that of the plot twists that you might find at the end of a thriller. Has chair been exchanged for sitter? Object exchanged for subject? If so, by what means? How? And perhaps more importantly, we might ask why. A brief caption down at the bottom of the image, which is obviously a little small for some of you in the back to read, says, gives us a clue. It says, life, it gets better and better every year. In the future, we will sit upon an elastic column of air. This is sort of amazing prediction about the future of chair design. The chair, Breuer reminds us, even if he can't show us, is still there, imminent, present, composed of a concealed and imagined technology. But we might say then that the chair in Breuer's film, like Marx's famous table from the first chapter of Capital, walks out on stage and stands on its head and evolves out of its brain grotesque ideas, far more wonderful than if it had begun dancing of its own will. And one might object that the stage for Marx's table, of course, is the market, which is not the same stage that we're dealing with here, a more experimental and pedagogical context of the Bauhaus. But that's true. But I think we should also not forget about the Bauhaus's ambitions to mass produce all of these chairs for a market. The structure of the stage of the market is a structure not of a thing itself, but rather of the thing considered from a particular point of view, that of abstract exchange value. And it's on these grounds that I think we can productively make use of Marx's powerful aesthetic concepts of the subject-object relations that are in the marketplace to understand this strange film or poster. In light of the vanishing act between the last two frames, Breuer is asking that we view his chairs through a simulated time image of film solely from the vantage point of their status as surface structures. And moreover, these surface structures, we're clearly meant to understand from the beginning and ending moments of the film, are derived from their ability to take on the forms and the subjectivities of their occupants or sitters. But why does the chair disappear as soon as the putative ideal seating subject arrives? Weirdly, Marx, again, can be quite clear on this point. By coming out on the stage, the table, qua use value, also disappears in Marx's reading. What is there instead is a supersensible and social fetish and fetishism. the whole theory of commodity fetishism. The table as commodity engenders a situation in which, quote, the products of the human brain appear as autonomous figures endowed with a life of their own, which enter into relations both with each other and with the human race, end quote. One appearance has been substituted for another. The thing, das Ding, has become image, das Bild. It's precisely this kind of quick change that we're seeing in Breuer's film images of his chairs and their futures. As Jean-Luc Nancy, the wonderful French philosopher, has argued, quote, entering and exiting, that's what makes the image, appearing and disappearing. The image disputes the presence of the thing. In the image, the thing is not content simply to be. The image shows that the thing is and how it is. The image is what makes the thing out of its simple presence and brings it into presentia, to being out in front of itself, turned towards the outside. This is not a presence for a subject. It's not a representation in the ordinary, excuse me, mimetic sense of the word. It is, on the contrary, if one can put it this way, presence as subject. In the image, or as image, and only in this way, the thing, whether it's an inert thing or a person, is posited as subject. The thing presents itself. So that's Nancy's, I think, very wonderful explication of how images work in relation to the thingly world that we all live in. The chair in the final frame of Breuer's film is an image of a chair in which the chair does not appear. Elastic rather than plastic, functional rather than formal, its invisible form conforming to the woman's body rather than to its own properties as a static object. This is a powerful image of what we commonly refer to as comfort, and I'll come back to that term in a few minutes. Ein Bauhaus film thus puts the question to us, what happens to the chair aesthetically considered, i.e. as an object in relation to a subject, when the first principle governing its design, that we should not experience the experience of sitting, causes it to disappear from view? That's a weird riddle, and it was preoccupation of several other figures at the Bauhaus, and I'm going to try to steer us through a few different examples. But this is Moholy-Nagy doing experiments with lifting objects into the air using compressed air, in this case a screwdriver. Seems like a very dangerous experiment to do, but never mind. So we're going to go from Breuer on a little bit of a tour of some successors to Breuer's idea, exploring the notion of the chair as this surface. His exact contemporaries, Heinz and Bodo Rasch, wrote a book, Der Stuhl, which uses much the same kind of visual vocabulary. In addition to taking up the same mode of illustration, showing sitting bodies suspended in midair in various poses, the Rasches began their treatise on chair design and manufacture with the simple claim that, quote, der moderne Mensch ist an den Platz seiner Tätigkeit gebunden, i.e., in English, the modern person is bound to the place or seat, that's the Platz, of his activity, end quote. Whereas this modern person may be engaged in any number of activities by making use of his or her various active organs, they argued, the organs of the legs and rump were required not to participate in any form of activity, but rather to bear or support, to tragen or to stützen, the active organs. The chair then had to be considered as a situation in which one holds up the body as if it had no legs, no rump. And here's some more images from this. Sorry that this is a hunting stool that they idealized as a support for the body. The support must adjust itself to the nature of the activity. It should do this to the greatest extent possible, in their view, up to 100%, they say, while not limiting freedom of movement. The ideal, it must follow bodily movements, giving way to changes in posture. This flexibility and accommodation of the body could be accomplished, the Rasches argued, only through rigorous analysis of varying postures, the bodies themselves, and through designing chairs in profile. In addition to analyzing conventional postures with Breuer's technique of removing the chair from the image, and that's an idea that has a long afterlife in ergonomics, as we'll see, they also designed their chairs precisely to mimic the posture of the human body in its various poses. The sitting subject thus embodied in the object, and then the object, granted this subjectivity, imposes this impressed subjectivity back upon the sitter. So this is the notion of prosthesis. This strange attitude towards the design of chairs was elevated to the status of a guiding principle on an international stage by several different people, particularly emigres from Europe to the United United States during the rise of Nazism and World War II. And so here I'm just showing you two examples. I love Alto's sitting and resting man smoking his little pipe there. Here, Mies van der Rohe's drawing of the posture of the person on one of his sinuous S-curve chairs. But by far the most important figure in this story is the figure of Breuer's student and star pupil at Harvard, Elliot Noyes, who became the first curator of industrial design at the Museum of Modern Art in 1940, and his first exhibition, the competition Organic Design and Home Furnishings of 40 to 41, radicalized Breuer's re-theorization of the chair as an invisible mediation between object and subject. On the inside cover of the exhibition catalog, alongside his own definition of organic design and provocative quotes from Plato and St. Thomas Aquinas, William Morris, Adolf Loos, Noyes included two quotations from Lewis Mumford in particular that emphasized Mumford's early conviction that in order to cope with modern technology, the human being must be fully integrated physically and psychically with that technology, whereby, Mumford asserted, technology would become humanized or naturalized. And in his book, Technics and Civilization of 1934, from which those passages are taken, I'm not going to quote them at length to you today, Mumford clearly states that the site at which these two elements, human and machine, met, what we call today the interface, must therefore be the site of design reform. And so Noyes has a brief essay on chair construction in the catalog, where he insists that this could be accomplished through an articulation of the chair as a surface. The traditional armchair, built by hand, he said, and weighing as much as 45 pounds, was gradually being superseded by chairs built out of less material and designed to be mass-produced by machines. And to illustrate the point, Noyes included just such a chair in the exhibition, haphazardly torn apart and locked in a steel cage, actually, in the exhibit. I'm sorry I don't have a photo of the jail that it's in front of a photo of King Kong, and identified by a large sign reading, Cathedra Gargantua, genus Americanus. Weight when fully matured, 60 pounds. Habitat, the American home. Devours little children, pencils, fountain pens, bracelets, clips, earrings, scissors, hairpins, and other small flora and fauna of the domestic jungle. Is rapidly becoming extinct, end quote. So the vaguely humorous but critical point was pretty clear. The problem with such chairs was not their size, but their depth. The chair, Noyes implied, needed no depth, but only a structure and a functional surface. So by applying some modern functional principles, such as S-curve springs and forming the chair out of rigid but pliable materials, like steamed plywood and so on, designers could produce chairs of what he called extreme elegance along rational lines. And the winners of the competition, Charles Eames and Eero Saarinen, did just that with their conversation chair. The drawing includes an elevation drawn on a grid of a human figure and the continuous lines of contact with the surfaces of the chair. All other structural apparatus, notably here in the drawing that I'm blowing up for you a little bit here, the legs. All the structure is omitted, leaving only the chair and its putative essence as surface. This approach to designing in profile, coordinating the shape of the chair to the postures it must sustain, as we've seen already in a lot of examples, has this long pedigree before. But where Noyes and Eames and Saarinen would take it is kind of where I'd like to turn our attention now. Although this abstract and sectional human figure that they draw here was, in 1940, not yet based on any scientific or even idiosyncratic measurements, Eames eventually went on to derive a system for actually taking molds of a normative human body to establish the curvature of the chair's sitting surface. This began with a project intended to revive his architectural practice after he moved to Los Angeles with his second wife, Ray Eames, during World War II. In 1943, they learned that the Army's regulation metal leg splints were in fact doing more harm than good to wounded soldiers. And so calculating the problem was due to the rigid linear geometry of the splints. They designed this famous icon of modern design. A single piece molded plywood splint that conformed to the curved form of the average human leg. Of course, the average human leg was actually Charles Eames's own leg, so a little bit of self-aggrandizement there, and a real you can get a new understanding of normativity by looking at that example. The symmetrical holes relieved the stress of the bent plywood surface and provided space to thread bandages and dressings around the wounded leg. This anthropomorphic technique and aesthetic from the splint, in which an object is carefully compensating for the pathological body, renormalizing the wounded organ by imposing an ideal shape or normative shape of that organ back onto it, again emphasizes the curious paradox of physiological science and organic design logic. The form of the human body is abstracted and exteriorized, re-embodied in the object, and then reapplied to the dismembered body, whence it came, all in the effort to make it and keep it whole again. So we're just pulling things apart in order to put them back together as wholes. Eames soon turned these therapeutic casting and warping techniques he developed in the design of the splint towards the problem of chair design, quite famously, in an exhaustive series of designs for the furniture company Herman Miller. And I'm not going to go into any of that in detail, and obviously a lot of that is going to be familiar to those design buffs amongst you already. But I want to turn our attention to a sort of different way of looking at this problem rather than the museum gallery and the domestic sphere. And that involves looking at the syncretic applied science of ergonomics, which we've actually bandied about as a term quite a bit today, and is obviously a big ticket item in Google's and lots of other companies' activities. In short, ergonomics is the effort to invert the terms of an industrial logic that had prevailed in the previous decades. It's a new term. It's invented in 1949 in a British naval research laboratory. All those details aren't so important. But what it really does is it imagines, rather than finding a person who is appropriate to doing a particular task, that would be the logic of Taylorism, to invert that logic and explore instances, and so these are examples of projects developed under a Taylorist mindset. Instead, imagines a situation in which there is no way, there is no human that could perform this work, so what kind of apparatus can we apply to the body in order to protect it in this new hostile environment, which can range from high-altitude bomber aircraft to your desk. And so here is just an emblematic series of images that deal with ergonomics as the man-machine system. And we can think of the interface as the hyphen that sits in between man and machine, or human and machine in that. So I just brought a few more images of this sectional attitude towards depicting the human body as a surface. These are from Henry Dreyfuss's famous manual. And then this is from Grandjean's book, still consulted by some designers today about how to shape our gear. And here again, you see this technique, and that's what I'd like to turn our attention to a little bit. So let's see, yeah. So I just wanted you to, oh, I'm in the wrong spot. There we go. Here, this is the attitude of ergonomics to the human body, and I want to just give you a little bit more insight into where that came from. One of the path-breaking studies that helped form the field of ergonomics was the Swedish anthropometrist Bengt Ekerblom's standing and sitting posture of 1948, the year before ergonomics and human engineering really become commonplaces in all areas of design. Since all books on ergonomics demand that they be read by their cover, let's start there. The profile ornamenting the cover is ostensibly that of a chair. If so, however, it is a chair composed only of this now familiar single continuous surface, with a seat slightly tilted back towards the backrest and a gently protruding bulge at the base of the back. And you probably already guessed that this is the familiar arc of lumbar support. It's the first one, really. It is the model for the one you experience when you sit in a car, for instance. But on closer inspection, we see that this is no chair. Where are the back legs? How does this chair remain standing? Returning to the title, we see that this book is not really a book about chairs at all, but really about postures and their form, and how to conform them. Åkerblom followed the tradition of those gruesome 19th century anthropometric studies that had established the human body's center of gravity by freezing cadavers in various positions and then thrusting steel rods through them. It's a rather unpleasant business. Most of the book is a rather dry discussion of the various stresses acting upon the body in various positions, sitting, standing, and a lot of others. Here. In his own original experiments, however, Åkerblom developed a set of ideal measurements for chair design through a new combination of statistical methods, X-ray photography, and a peculiarly grotesque invention, removing the spines from cadavers to submit them to various stresses associated with sitting. Despite the violence of this operation, Åkerblom preserves a rather clinical tone throughout, especially when describing his test subjects, many of which were John and Jane, or perhaps given the context, Sven and Inge Does, recovered from the local morgue. For example, one specimen was identified as following, quote, L1 to L4, 3 segments from a man aged 44 years, normal build, weight 72 kilograms, about 1 day after death. Cause of death, alcoholism with cirrhosis of the liver and acute heart failure. Were freed from muscles and tendons, end quote. So these vertebrae, which are removed from the bodies and then drilled holes and then lead shot is put into them and then they're X-ray photographed under different tensile conditions, are what he's working with in order to create an organic, ameliorative, holistic approach to design. It's really quite extraordinary. Slightly counterintuitive. So by mapping out the curvature of the other elements of the skeleton as well, especially the femur and the hip bone, here you can see him using X-ray photography in a different way, Åkerblom likewise calculated the proper curvature of the seat surface, the proper distance between seat and backrest, and so on. Using force diagrams derived from simple Newtonian mechanics, he calculated the proper tilt of each as well, balancing the forces carefully to ensure that the chair would not only impart a slight curvature to the body, but also hold the seated body in place, actually actively intervene in the person's posture. One might expect a rather radical design to emerge from all of this, but sadly no. The first chair designed using his method by the Swedish designer Gunnar Eklöf is surprisingly conventional in appearance, only the jaunty curvature of the backrest to provide lumbar support and slight tilt of the seat reveal the ostensible advances made by the scientist. No attempt to conceive of the chair as pure surface in formal terms is in evidence here. There's no visual rhetoric of that yet. While Åkerblom and Eklöf may have lacked a certain amount of imagination to achieve this, the techniques that he pioneered nonetheless became essential contributions to ergonomics, which we've already discussed. This neologism formed from the Greek words for work and natural law. But it's this activity, this active role of a subjectified object that I'd really like to explore the implications of as we move forward here. So, skipping over some things in interest of time. Okay. Modernist design historiography has reinforced an ergonomic understanding of the modern chair, even as it has refused to really address its implications. And perhaps the best and best known work on chairs by an architectural historian, which is the chapter on the constituent furniture of the 19th and 20th centuries in Siegfried Gideon's Mechanization Takes Command, also of 1948, Gideon establishes a common trope in the narration of the development of modernist aesthetics. Gideon, for his part, sought to eliminate the conventional understanding of aesthetics from his analysis. Ruling taste, his term, the ornamental excrescence that covered the constituent facts of chair design had to be peeled away, banished, exercised in order to reveal the emerging modernist technical object, a revolution against what he called the reign of the upholsterer. In lieu of this ornamental surface, Gideon claimed, what the historian should consider is the merging of subject and object in a truly modern chair, a functional surface. And his conclusion is radical in its implications. Here's how he writes about it. He says, To know how the American would sit if the ruling taste were not master in his house, we must watch him at the office. How the desk chair behaves beneath him with almost organic flexibility, and how he unconsciously varies his posture without end. The American in the office seems to have become one creature with his chair, as the Arab with his horse, end quote. Amazing, right? Guy could really write, and write weirdly. So given what I've tried to show you guys so far, I think it's wholly unsurprising to find that in this small chapter, the human figure disappears as quickly as it had appeared in the discussion of the 19th century, subsumed into the dynamic unity of surface and structure epitomized by Breuer's cantilevered tubular metal and Alto's bent plywood chairs. A different kind of claim about the progression towards the realization of this magical surface is offered up by Nicholas Pevsner in Pioneers of Modern Design, originally published as Pioneers of the Modern Movement in 1936, and issued in a new and revised edition in the year of ergonomics' formal birth of 1949. Although it's hard to imagine Pevsner using such a formulation, it's pretty amazing that he locates the beginning of all of modern art and the synthesis of art and labor, the synthesis of art and techniques in a chintz, essentially in textiles. He approaches this whole problem of the superficial logic of modernism from that vantage point. I won't go into the details there either in the interest of time, so that I don't bore you with art historical details, which I, of course, revel in. In Pevsner's story, he can't reach, actually, using this logic, much past 1914. It's beyond the scope of his study, but also some of the terms that he uses start to break down. So I'd like to look a little bit at that. This whole question of comfort, and of course, its opposite, by which it's actually defined in the dictionary, discomfort. Okay. So there's lots of critiques of the ideology of comfort, from dismissals to corrections of the theory. And these range from critiques of the bourgeoisie to the most nuanced contemporary attempts to articulate a functional ergonomics. For instance, the work of Galen Krantz at Berkeley, who's one of the foremost critics and apologists for chair ergonomics. In her The Chair, Rethinking Culture, Body and Design, she raises questions about the cultural, sociological, and economic aspects of the chair. She looks closely at studies of the chair's usage in various contexts and levels stinging criticism at the myopic character of much of ergonomic research. However, hers is no straightforward sociological critique. Rather, it involves her embrace of the physical discipline of the Alexander technique and an ethos of personal responsibility in relation to posture. In fact, she often lectures lying down on the floor as a way to sort of model this behavior for her students. In the end, we learn, perhaps to our great physical benefit, that if we shift our posture from time to time and avoid numerous harmful physical effects of sitting, we can design better environments for ourselves, ever wary of those objects that are plainly, in this view of the world, out to get us, right? So going even further than her ergonomist forebears, Krantz supplants any question of aesthetics with a question of damage, very straightforwardly. The design and use of chairs is, for her, no longer a matter of defining social relations, of beauty or ugliness, or even of economic or political organization. Rather, the quality, in the sense of both value and essence of the chair, is determined by its ability to accommodate the human body and its practices without unduly hurting it. Any messy and difficult questions of deontology, i.e., should the office worker be in the office all day, are elided and supplanted with an ideology of this personal responsibility. So, it's an ideology. If we can say with Althusser, maybe many of us wouldn't in this room, but that ideology in general has no history, then it is more than evident that the ideology of flexibility offers no substantive advantages over that of the ideology of surface, insofar as both remain entrenched within a protective enclosure of disciplinary assumptions that emerge from the repeating image with which I began my remarks today. An aesthetics that places the concept of comfort at its logical core is bound by the very structure of the relations it posits to short circuit. Like piece, comfort is a negative concept, the absence of discomfort, and it has no positive qualities. Every commentator on comfort explains this. Its only visible and aesthetic aspects or symbols are embodied in artifacts of its making: cushions and pillows, curtains, warm fires and hearths, or whatever you imagine when you think about being comfortable, floating in a sensory deprivation tank. I don't know, whatever your jam is. So what precisely is comfortable about these things? I want to suggest that in order to elucidate this negativity of comfort, which in all ways is a concept that appears to be qualitative but then disappears into its other, discomfort or pain, means that we have to look closely at pain itself. And this is a fascinating realm of study and medicine in the 20th century in particular. In the most probably thoroughgoing modern treatment of the subject of comfort, which is a book called The Mental and Physical Aspects of Pain, also published in this landmark year of 1949, the endocrinologist V.C. Medved identifies excuse me, a core problem in the very definition of the phenomenon. Ancient Greek, he states, offered dozens of names for the different kinds of pain and of pleasure, and Plato asserted that man should be trained from childhood to find his pleasures and pains in the correct and proper objects. However, this specific but diffuse body of concepts had been concentrated and reduced, by the time we arrive in modern English, to the single word, albeit a word with many connotations. Unhinged from any secure reference, Medved's, in his interpretation, the modern word pain left only one avenue for its definition, that of articulating the absence of pleasure. He writes, "Pain does not possess an obvious sense organ, like hearing, sight, smell, taste, or touch. It concerns every part of the body. Its main characteristic is unpleasantness." And again, a negative thing. According to Medved, competing medical theories of pain, both physiological and psychological, emerged in the 19th and 20th centuries oriented around two central hypotheses. One, the sensory theory, in which pain is another sensation or sensory apparatus, like heat or cold, brightness or dimness, etc., registered by a specific, though as yet undescribed structure within the nervous system, experienced at a level beyond the threshold of acceptability. And then two, the emotional or psychogenic pain theory, where this is where you experience pain through the mind, even when no direct physical sensational experience can be identified as the proper cause of the suffering. Both, Medved argues, are relevant to a future comprehensive theory of pain. However, to date, the physician is left only with a language at one degree of remove from the phenomenon itself. As he points out in this wonderful passage, he says, "Pain may be sharp, stabbing, cutting, biting, pricking, stinging, burning, smarting, pinching, gnawing, throbbing, boring, dull, aching, crushing, griping, colicky, lightning, shooting, tearing, or slight, moderate, severe, agonizing, excruciating. With the help of additional phrases, for instance, as if, finer nuances can be described which can be understood even by those who had no personal experience of a certain type of pain," end quote. So pain, for Medved, has an analogical structure. Like comfort, which is associated with objects, it's always associated with something else, usually an adjective or gerund derived from a verb, describing the process of wounding. However, types of pain are localizable within the body itself. As Medved stresses, the quality of pain, this is him writing, the quality of pain is not a function of the stimulus. An injection of 0.5 cc's of hypertonic saline produces burning in the skin, aching pain in the muscles, and pain of a different tone in the subcutaneous tissues. Thus, quality of pain is a function of the injured tissue. This tissue will always give pain of the same quality, whatever the stimulus. End quote. Pain, he says, is, again quoting, "in the phantom limb of a person who lost his arm. The body image remains when the part of the body is lost, and the opposite occurs in the same corticothalamic lesions where the body image seems lost, although the part remains," end quote. Pain thus has a location, a locus within the body, but that location is only determinable if the body has an image of the location affected. It is in this image that the excess of appearances causes pain. And though this image that pain covers over, and through this image, pain covers over other sensations, obliterating and replacing any other self-generated image of the body. The architectural historian, interestingly, Joseph Rickwert, seems to subscribe, at least in part, to this point of view when he states at the outset of his often republished and cited essay, The Sitting Position, A Question of Method, that to sit in a chair is to return to the womb, and every act of standing up is a rebirth, echoing the pain of childbirth. Following this logic, to sit in the chair is to surrender one's subjectivity, to return, if only partially, to an objective state belonging to another body, in an attempt to turn back the clock on our unceasing and violent encounter with the world. It is considered as an imaginary experience to disappear. And as Elaine Scarry has famously written in her wonderful study on pain, quote, "The shape of the chair is not the shape of the skeleton, the shape of the body weight, nor even the shape of pain perceived, but rather the shape of perceived pain wished gone," end quote. The idea, the eidos or appearance of the chair, of comfort, is thus an erasure, a forgetting of a disappearance. If the chair partakes in this sort of double disappearing act, a process that we could figure with any number of images from the history of art that use chairs as portraits of an absence, for instance, Van Gogh's here, his chair from 1888, how can we then think about the chair as a concrete fact? An attention to an anesthetics, a means of recognizing the concealment of relations between subjects and objects, of subjects becoming objects, might allow us, I propose, to acknowledge that within conventional aesthetics lies a series of overdeterminations as to the permanence and presence of appearance. But I'm moving a little bit ahead of my concluding argument here, and I want to just explain very briefly what is meant by anesthetics in this instance. First of all, talking about aesthetics, I'm talking about the science of subject-object relations, not just what one likes in terms of rock music or flowers. It's not a sensibility, but rather a way of describing the way that we relate to the world. And anesthetics is a way of thinking about this situation being negated, subject-object relations being destroyed, and instead looking at the media that relate them to one another and construct them as such, if only temporarily. And so what I want to do is think about the limited sense in which we deploy that term, anesthesia, in studies moving forward, as just the kind of medicine that you use to stop experiencing pain for the purposes of undergoing surgery or whatever, or experiencing chronic pain, and instead expand that term outwards. And in fact, it was thought of that way in the 19th century, and we've gradually lost this as the routinization of anesthesia in medicine and surgery has expanded. So I'm going to skip over some of the finer points of that and instead try to sort of attend to a difference between these chairs that we see here plainly rendering the dialectic between pain and pleasure, or presence and absence that haunt the history of art here, quite familiar and famous ones. Of course, Kossuth's three chairs, and some even more sort of disturbing images here. That's probably the worst one I'll show you. Utterly awful work of art. But Rachel Whiteread's wonderful casts here would be another iconic example of this figuring of an absence. And the ameliorative and still ergonomic sense of design. This is where I'd like to end. The Aeron Chair, designed by Chadwick and Stump, is the direct product of an ergonomic and strictly imagistic genealogy, taking his Akerblom's study as paradigmatic and adding in a half-century of statistics produced by nearly 3 generations of anthropometrists and experimental psychologists and so on. This chair is both the actualization and symbol of an ergonomic point of view. Almost every single element, the backrest, the armrest, the seats, the casters of the chair is movable in more than 2 dimensions, transforming each element into an organ of its own. The Aeron Chair is the anesthetic developed into a coherent aesthetic. As Stumpf tells it, quote, "The transparency of the chair as a visual element was in keeping with the idea of transparent architecture and technology, which Aeron pioneered in advance of Apple's transparent iMac computers, he points out pridefully. Just as the computer presents the user with a putatively transparent image of a tool while concealing the impossibly complex mimicry of formal logic that constitutes its inner workings, the Aeron Chair asks us to see through it while missing that which it masks. It accomplishes this through the palliative logic of ergonomics. Again, Stumpf, he says, ergonomically, it ought to do more than just sit there. It should actively intercede for the health of the person who sits in it longer than she should, end quote. Such statements as this sound perfectly rational. We're used to thinking of the chair as an ameliorative agent, soothing balm applied to a burn, restoring our bodies back to ourselves. What is important here, though, is to read Stumpf's statement again. The chair is not just sitting, it's sitting for. What is invisible in the image is that the Aeron Chair is the extent to which it asks us to become object, an abstract component within an extrinsically determined man-machine system. Systems, as a manual by the management guru Leslie Matthews points out, are always invisible until you give them tangible form. So I'm looking in this study to artworks and also to the theater. This is a set design for Eugène Ionesco's marvelous absurdist play, The Chairs, a kind of another version of Waiting for Godot, as a way of exploring that, because otherwise we can't really see what touches us. So thanks a lot for your attention, and I'd be happy to take any questions.